Poetic peeps and gentle persons, in-betweeners and nonconformers, genders all and genders equal. Welcome to Eat the Storms, the poetry podcast. My name is Damien B Donnelly. I'm your host and producer, and thank you to you, the listeners, for tuning in. Whether that's on platforms like Spotify, Apple, Google, Breaker, Podbean, Player FM, Overcast, Pocket Cast, Castbox, Podcast Addicts, iTunes, Amazon Music, or now even YouTube. Hello and welcome to episode 9, season 9. It's another special episode. Last week we had our special episode for Palestine, a podcast for Palestine, our first ever fundraising episode, and within 2 days we had raised just under €2,000 and it's still ongoing. Thank you to all those who tuned in, who listened, who took part in the podcast, who read, and thank you to all those who donated. The funds will go to children, not numbers. Next week, we have another special episode, our traditional Christmas feast. We have Christmas with Eat the Storms. And today, we have one more episode, one special episode, dedicated to one man, one writer, one poet, one curator and creator of multiple platforms in order for writers to share and promote their work. So, all that's required for you is to make sure you have a comfy seat, a plethora of biscuits, and that there is a cup of tea, a pint of the black stuff, or perhaps an early glass of mulled wine. My name is Damien B Donnelly. This is Eat the Storms, a poetry podcast, and I hope you enjoy the show. Today, I am delighted to be joined in this special episode of Eat the Storms, not only by an extraordinary poet, a syllabic poet to be precise. His work moves through the themes of love, loss, and memory. Since 2010, he's created an entire online poetic world, the meeting of rural and suburban. This sub-rural world he has called Subruria. But he is also a master curator. And being a master curator, he has also become, since 2020, a master community builder with the remarkable iamb platform. Not only to share voices of already established writers, but equally emerging writers, where they get to actually read their poems to us, the audience, instead of us just reading their poems from a page. And then most recently in 2022, he began After, another community curation of ekphrastic poetry. My guest today, of course, is none other than Mark Antony Owen. Mark, thank you so much for joining me on this special episode of Eat the Storms today. Thank you so much for sharing your world, and I'm delighted that we are going to have guests on the show today who will be reading parts of your world. But before we start exploring Subruria, iamb, and all that comes after, I wonder if I can just begin with beginnings. How did this necessity, and it feels to me like it is a necessity because you are so prolific. How did this all start? How did poetry sort of carve its very essence into all that you do?
How did it start? Yeah, good question. So obviously the word Subruria is one that I've been bandying around for many years to describe the kind of places where I'd lived and grown up. I've always lived in a space where town and country bleed one into the other. So I'm very aware of the two different kind of ways of life coexisting. I searched for it on the internet about 15 years ago, couldn't find any reference to it whatsoever. So I thought, great, I've coined this. But then in 2011, I did find one obscure reference to it in some US planning document to do with land management. So I assumed, oh, well, somebody's obviously beaten me to it because they put it on the internet. I hadn't at that point. But I was undeterred. I thought, right, I'm going to buy the domain name and I'm going to do something with this. But I wasn't sure what I was going to do at that point. And then I had a conversation with a couple of gents on Twitter in 2012, in the summer of that year, Adrian Slatcher and JT Walsh, both poets. And when I started to describe what I thought Subruria would be, this kind of evolving but unfolding collection, for want of a better word, I use project normally, of releases of poetry over a phased period over a number of years. Both of them said to me, that sounds a lot like Walt Whitman and the Leaves of Grass. You know, the fact that he, during his life, he only ever produced essentially one book, but he expanded and indeed contracted it at different times. And I kind of thought, I like that. I like that idea of a collection that grows. And I like the fact that it was an honest way of presenting my poetry. And I say honest because some poets, they will produce various collections from time to time, and they give them all different titles. And some of those collections are themed, and they rightly have titles which encapsulate that theme. Other poets, and I'm one of them, we tend to write in the same frame of reference all of the time. And it kind of felt dishonest to me to sort of go along publishing these differently titled collections over a number of years, when essentially I was always writing about the same topic, the same world, the same way of life. So I figured, why not just bring it together under one title and phase those releases? So that's kind of how it started.
It's extraordinary because every now and then I pop in, I'd like drop by the Boa nannies with their skin of cardigan and their hissings of so personal, and yet we can all relate to it. The community, those labourers, all on streets that are named after meadows that once were actual meadows, these delicate observations, the weights of kestrel kisses, the cattles of cars, and this playfulness with words as well, the sand-made butter pats. Every time I go in, I feel like I almost remember wandering through Amsterdam in the evening where they don't have curtains on their windows, and it feels like you're walking through these streets and you're looking in and you're seeing these lives being lived and these sort of secrets sort of pouring out onto the streets, and we're kind of being allowed in. Was it always the sense in your head, is this a world that you've created? Are we supposed to go into it? Is this your creation, or is this just a way of sharing what you see?
It's a bit of both. One of the things I've said frequently about Subruria is that I'm not going to tell you where the fact and the fiction are. There will be things in there that will seem fictitious, which are actually 100% true. There are other things in there which will seem true, but I just invented them. I don't see why why truth should have to ruin a good poem.
Yeah,
quite simply. I like what Kim Moore, the poet, said, where she said, poetry doesn't have to be the truth, but it has to have truth in it.
Yeah.
And I think that is very, very true for me. These little vignettes that I put together, where you get little flashes of the rural, the countryside, the intimate, set against these jarring stories from my own life or lives of people around me. It's also a great get out of jail card, or get out of jail free card rather, for if anybody says, well, what did you write that about me? Oh yeah, but that's part of the fiction. And also, if you're smart, don't speak up. So yes, it's as much an observed and recorded, my recorded word. That's why I title it over the top, Mark Antony Owen Subruria, not Subruria as a concept for everyone. It's my interpretation of how I've lived it and how I've seen it. Other people may experience this kind of word differently.
But that's the interesting point. Like fact, poetry, I think sometimes, it rises off the page because it's stemmed or it's rooted in fact, but it's the fiction that sort of gives it wings, that gives it that sort of space to breathe and to sort of fly. In the same way that when you have these intimate little things, like I was saying, sort of the skin of a cardigan, like these descriptions that I think seem so personal, so specific. But yet in that being so specific, suddenly it becomes universal because we all find these ways to relate to it. We all find these ways to make it ours, perhaps, or slightly to move in. And it feels like that whenever I go for a wander. It feels like I get to leave my life for a while but also see shades of it in these, as you said, in these vignettes that you have on offer. It's wonderfully aided by the fact that you narrate every poem. You have the most incredible voice. You have a voice that is so kind and considerate and careful of how it pronounces each word that at times you lull us into this space that we feel very safe. And then we have these poems, we have these pieces that are very almost, talk about the state of the world today, how we are losing the countryside, how everything's becoming concrete. As I said, the meadows that were once meadows are just streets named meadows covered in concrete. Was it always going to be something that you were going to read, and has reading always been important to you when you're writing poetry?
Yes and no. No, only in the sense that I was fearfully mic shy when I first started. And to record the first release, which was 45 poems, I had to do it quite quickly, which is why I think if you listen to those, you can hear me. I get through the poems at a bit of a lick because I'm just desperate to get to the end without stumbling. What I hadn't considered at that point is that if I just allowed myself to read, and if I fumble, then great, fine, I'll just stop, pick up. Exactly the same instruction I give people who read for iamb. Don't worry if you make a mistake, just stop, pause, pick up again from the next line. So I was nervous about going on the mic, but I got comfortable more and more doing it. And now I can go on open mics online and all this kind of stuff. And I can do these things now because I've built the confidence up. But yes, I did always want the recordings to be there because I truly believe that the poet is the person who knows best how they want the poem to sound. Now, having said that, I do feel that there are some poets, obviously I'm not going to name names, but there are some poets who are perhaps not the best interpreters, the best readers of their own work, maybe because they're unused to it, maybe because they're nervous. But there are others who, if you heard it in anyone else's voice, it just wouldn't be right. It wouldn't feel authentic. And so this care that you say that I put into each reading, absolutely true. That's precisely why I do it with such care, because I want you to really understand how I heard it in my head.
And with that, it's time to take a moment away from our conversation behind the storms with Mark Antony Owen and welcome one of our first guests on the show today. This first poet joins us from Essex in England. Their work has appeared in places like iamb, Poetry Wales, Under the Radar and Magma, among others. She is the winner of the 2024 Poetry Business International Book and Pamphlet Competition, and her own pamphlet, Tiny Bright Thorns, was published by Ninepence Press earlier this year. Reading one of Mark's poems, followed by her own poem, I am delighted to welcome back to Into the Storms, Jen Feroze.
Brioche for the Starlings. Loading the coffee machine, smoothing home its damp paper beak, he notices starlings canteening the apple tree, their banquet of stale brioche. Princes, feasting on the hunt, their brief, enviable lives. Passion fruit. Paul has overheard that it's my birthday. He brings us breakfast on the veranda, dewy and humid. At the centre of my plate is a passion fruit, big as a tennis ball and split open. It's like looking into two dark gold ponds, clogged with frog spawn that snaps between the teeth. He's made doughy pancakes too, sticky with berries and honey. As your fingers make lazy circles on my thigh under the table, Paul is calling to his sunbirds. Pipettes of sugar syrup for the littlest ones. His whistling polished by decades of mornings like this. Thin brown arms steady, chin lifted, and song carrying over the fruit trees and ferns. Hot rain and bird calls, and the electric hiss of mosquitoes. We are so far away from our lives.
And now, just before we go back to our conversation with Mark, it's time to welcome our second guest. This is the author of the poetry collection And Suddenly You Find Yourself, which was published in 2017 by Parthenon Books, and it was featured on the Wales Arts Review Best of 2017. Her second collection, Small, was published in 2020. Today, joining us for the first time in Eat the Storms, reading one of Mark's poems and one of her own poems, I'm delighted to welcome Natalie Holborow.
A designated public place. You're in a designated public place watching a thin stegosaurus of bunting get battered by the wind. The jubilee beds crowned by grey roses, the never-ending rain. This time of year there would normally be stalls, bouncy castles, young mothers wiping picnics from the faces of toddlers. Look up and you might see swifts, winding invisible maypole streamers round the shifting contrail of a jet. Today swings and swung, slick and climbable frames. You are in a designated public place, yet you've never felt more private in your life. Come again when the bins are dizzy with wasps and the bandstand buzzes with hits you can hum, before that old jailer winter chains the gates. You won't always recognize Hope when you see her. Sometimes she's hunched in the visitor's room, rolling a magazine into a baton, thumping her thigh like a Labrador tail, waiting for someone to show. Sometimes she's stretched tenderly across the bed, fingers crowding her mother's wrist, interrogating the blood for movement. And sometimes she's outside spinning coils of smoke like prayers into the bitter air, light crawling across her brow, angling her phone for signal. Maybe you missed her, ankle deep, footprints engulfed by the salt marsh, her mother's hand cream not quite laundered from her glove. Suppose she swims to you easily over disinfected tiles, sipping the bruised violet shine of the morning, or else she clatters in quite unexpectedly, through the vents in the hospital ceiling, belts of seaweed wrapping her waist, to tell you the tide's come in.
I think maybe we'll come back to talk about what's coming next and the scenes that are coming in 2025. But now that we're talking about sort of other poets and other voices, maybe we'll do just a little jump and talk a little bit about iamb, if that's okay. Because while we're talking about those poets who interpret their poems so well, I listened just before we came on here again to Ang Spice in Wave 1, reading his 3 pieces, and they almost broke me because he reads with the complete and utter 100% conviction of every word that he has put on the page. And that, in part, is a credit to you because you have created this extraordinary platform. It's been running since 2020. You've had voices like Kim Harvey, John McCulloch, Ang Spice, as we just said, Ray Howells. Wave 20 is coming in a few weeks' time. It includes Wendy Pratt, Mary Marchand, Dara Fleming, Simon Alderwick. So we are hearing poets who are living in the Philippines, in Ireland, in the United States, in the UK. It's completely global. It's, as you say yourself, it's part library of poets, part quarterly journal, where the established and the emerging talents are showcased side by side. But it's not just their poems, of course, or their words, it's also their readings. So we, again, the listeners, get to hear them bring their poem to life. How and why did this begin? How did you start thinking, well, maybe, I want to go out and start curating. I want to start building this community that has become iconic now. It's the place where poets want to be to read their work. And congratulations on that.
Thank you very much. It started as a tweet, as many things in my life have over the last 15 years. I was frustrated, I'll be honest. I was frustrated, and I was venting that frustration publicly through Twitter. at the fact that obviously because they're a charity and because they have limited resources, the Poetry Archive in the UK will never be able to bring the voices of so many contemporary poets who are not above a certain level, haven't achieved a certain amount in their career at that point. And it kind of irritated me that there wasn't a platform for these people who were emerging and were fantastic poets. I knew that, I'd read their work, and I wanted to give them a place to have their voice.
Mm-hmm.
And so initially I was just kind of venting about this. And then you can sort of see over a couple of days, if you look back in the archives, it's me kind of going, you know what, I might just try and build something. And literally from that cold start to 7 weeks later, it was launched. And it was launched on the day that Britain left the EU. So being international was a big fuck you to the Conservative government. And it was launched on St. Bridget's Day. How perfectly is that? And it was launched just before we were about to go into a pandemic. It was the most inauspicious possible time to launch a new journal, but it worked. And I did hand pick every poet for the first year. I only opened auditions for everybody else from year 2, and I had no idea whether that would work. I didn't know how many there would be, and there were about 180 auditions came in about a week, and I managed to fill 3 years. There were so many good poets. I couldn't just say, right, that's it. I'm just going to stop for a first year and bin everybody else. There was so much talent. I just thought it would be criminal to send these people away and make them do this all again next year. So I thought, I'm just going to fill my schedule up for the next 3 years.
And how much work does it involve? Because, we look at it from the outside, and, I'm doing the podcast. I realize, everybody tunes in on a Saturday and it's great. And they think, oh, lovely. And we'll tune on next Saturday and see what's going on. In the meantime, behind the scenes, I'm sort of, running round in spare moments, putting my own poetry things aside, putting sort of work to the edge for now and then to, chase people up, to get recordings, to try and have recordings that maybe are a little less background noise, a little less cars going on in the background, or car crashes even sometimes that you kind of hear. There's a lot of logistics to putting this craft, this beauty together. Is that easy to deal with?
Well, as you know, I've got 8 cats. I have 5 kids, but only 2 live at home now. And I'm incredibly busy with work. I work for a very, very small company, so it's just me and another guy, basically. And when we get busy, we get really busy, as we are right now. So yeah, all of these things, they play a part. Then obviously you need to spend time with the family, time with your partner, and all of this stuff comes on top. And yeah, it is quite hard. Even though I give myself 2 months after the poets have finished submitting all their work, it's still a tight schedule, 2 months to get each wave out. It's easier now because I smartly moved to a dynamic page system. So essentially one template, and I feed everything into a database, and the database makes it look pretty on screen for everybody else. What I work in is a boring spreadsheet most of the time. It's not as exciting as it looks on screen. The hardest bit, and it takes up nearly a half of those 2 months, is the recordings, because obviously people have different setups in their homes or wherever. They send me the recordings, as you've rightly identified. There is background noise, there is all sorts of stuff to clear up, and I enjoy doing it. And I want it to be as broadcastable as possible. So I will do everything from just removing the background hiss and hum to stitching together bits where they've fumbled a phrase and I've got to try and get it so that the word slices together seamlessly, which, sometimes goes better than others. Fading things in and out here and there. And the thing I've been doing in the last few waves is cleaning all the silences between all of the phrases. So all of the pops, the clicks, the breaths, everything is taken out and silenced, so that what you get feels more like what you'd hear on an audiobook or on a radio broadcast. I've tried to get it to feel just that little bit more professional, because I know obviously the Poetry Archive, they have their own equipment, they're in studios, they bring the poets in, they do their recordings. I don't have that luxury. It's very much a gentleman amateur venture. I have to rely on the individual poets to send me the recordings. And yes, some qualities are better than others, but I always, for every single person, I try my absolute hardest to get their voice and their poems sounding as good as I can. And if that means going back to them 2 or 3 times, even though it can be frustrating for both of us, I will do that because I want to showcase them at their best.
And you do, and I think that's what you have achieved and what we see. As I said, I think it's on everyone's list of the place that they kind of want to see their name, and you go on it and you look and you see the caliber, and it's extraordinary. Is it going to continue? Does it have an expiry date, or do you have an expiry date on it?
If fortune smiles on me, if my health stays good, I would like to take this all the way out to 100 waves.
Wow, brilliant.
I will be 72 by the time that happens. So, we'll see how far I get towards that magic number. But I would love to take it out to 100 waves.
And now it's time to have another break away from our conversation to welcome two more special guests to this episode, celebrating the poetry and the community building of Mark Antony Owen. My next guest is an Irish poet currently living in Winchester in the United Kingdom, whose work has appeared in iamb, After Poetry, The Rialto and more. She is the author of the poetry collection I Went Up the Lane Quite Cheerfully and Swing, which were published by Dempsey and Wendell, and the co-author of the anthology See Between Us from Ninepence Press. And again, to read one of Mark's poems and one of her own, it's always a joy to have her on the podcast. This is Georgia Hilton.
Hi there, my name is Georgia Hilton, and it's an absolute honour to have been asked to read a poem from Subruria today for this very special edition of Eat the Storms. I've been a fan of Mark's work for many years now, since I first came across it on Twitter. His close attention to detail, his commitment to craft, writing as he does in 9-syllabic forms exclusively, and his eye for a quirky or unusual image all give Mark's poetry a really distinctive quality that I think is almost impossible to emulate. His poems have their own voice, and he labours over them sometimes for many years, refining and cutting and tweaking, which is why they come out as these absolutely exquisite polished gems that you're lucky enough to hear today. So the poem that I'm going to read is called All Fields, from Subruria Release 3. All Fields. To have stood here in the early 60s, before this hill wore its necklace of charmless semis, when this was still all fields, still ungrazed by herds of houses. There must have been wheat, labourers, communities sheaved to the seasons, calls for planners to pick some other plot. Now pinwheels grow in allotments. There are paddling pools dazzling the sun. This is an absolutely beautiful poem, and I think the two images that stand out the most to me are the hill wearing its necklace of charmless semis and the fields still ungrazed by herds of houses. Just such beautiful, distinctive and unusual way to look at the world around you. And dazzling images, just like the paddling pools of the poem. Now, when Mark first asked me to read a poem for this edition of Eat the Storms, I was planning to read one of my Hampshire poems in tandem, because living not a million miles away from Mark, I recognise some of the same landscapes. And having lived in rural Hampshire villages and in the city of Winchester, we are surrounded by the past, and I have written poems about imagining the place I live in an earlier century. But I wanted to do something exclusive for this podcast and read something unpublished. And I was thinking about the expression that the past is another country. And it made me think that places abroad that perhaps we haven't visited also live in an imaginary space in the same way that the past does. So I decided to read an exclusive unpublished poem called Sometimes I Wish I Could Be in Minnesota. Sometimes I wish I could be in Minnesota, in those whiteout conditions that must be a little like death. Edges blur and soften. Landmarks are erased. The horizon is both infinite and non-existent. People too lose their individual characteristics, padded out in snow gear, blobs on a thermal imaging camera. Someone slips beneath the ice, is buried in a snowdrift, freezes to death unnoticed in the woods, is spirited away by wolves. It emerges first as a scandal, then becomes a rumour, finally a legend whispered to children on their first day at a new school. Perhaps they were caught in a blizzard. Maybe buzzards picked clean their bones. No one left now who knows for sure which house they lived in, or what was their favourite TV show, or if they were ever really born into this world of biting cold and bitter disappointments, or were always just a sort of cautionary tale. Thank you very much for listening, and congratulations again to Mark Antony Owen on his fantastic Subruria project. It's been an honour. Thank you.
And now for our next guest, we are heading to North Wales for a writer who won the 2016 Exeter Novel Prize, and her books are Blame It On Me, All That Glitters, and The Birds, the Rabbits, the Trees. Her most recent collection, Cactus Land, was published by Atomic Bohemian, and she is one of their founding members. And here to share one of Mark's poems and one of her own poems, it's always a delight to have with us Briony Collins.
Pierity by Mark Antony Owen. Kite tassels slipped from your string, you buoy on the breeze, living confetti, celebrating the simple fact of being here at all, a bow of wing, no thought of how you're using your time, how fast you're going. Dichotomy by Briony Collins. I don't know how to describe the way I am when I'm alone. Somewhere across the skyline, a cormorant is cutting the night, slicing through fossil vapour with wings the length of a single white line paced on a motorway, the staggered breath of paint beneath flight and exhaust.
So speaking of, sticking with communities, you've established this wonderful platform, as I said, that everybody wants to be involved in. But no, you decide, okay, well, that's not enough. Let's talk about acrostic poetry. Let's talk about after. As if you need more work, as if you need to fit more in. You do this, your second foray into community building after poems inspired by other arts, ekphrastic or ephrasis. Coming from the Greek word, coming from two Greek words, I think. One is ex, which means out, and then phrasin, to point out. It's been running since 2022. A new poem arrives with each new moon, and so far you've had people like Mary Ford Neal, Lucy Holm, A.R. Williams, Jack B. Bedell, Sue Finch, Gabriel Rosenstock, Beth Brooke, Georgia Hilton. Fantastic names. I believe that you were full all the way through 2025, with submissions opening again in October 2025. Tell us about this need to sort of branch off, to enter into this dialogue with other people's work, and how there are spare moments in your life, let alone anybody else's life, for this.
Well, the simple answer is there are no spare moments, and I'm a fool. Essentially, this was me kind of thinking out loud once again. I didn't really know what an after poem was. I kind of got what ekphrasis is, but I didn't really know what an after poem was. I see the examples of them all the time, and I want to write one as well. And I kind of feel like I may have done now, but I just thought, is there a place for this already? And I searched, and I found things like the ekphrastic review. There's one or two others out there, but I just kind of wanted to do something where there was this. I wanted a more regular publishing cadence, because I'm aware that quarterlies mean that you go long periods with nothing really happening. And so I settled on this idea of, okay, that can mean after dark, after hours. So that's where the dark theme comes from. And then I thought, well, hang on a minute, let's work this out. Full moons and new moons, why not? One every time. Just one poem to be focused on for a fortnight. Everybody can get involved, comment, like it, share it, whatever. And then I kind of thought, right, my system with iamb, with the auditions, worked better than I'd hoped. I managed to fill not 1 but 3 years ultimately. So I thought, what if I just run 1 month of submissions once a year and fill up the following year, and make a reserves list just in case anybody drops out, who then get to be published the following year, so that those people, those 6 people or whatever it is, they are guaranteed publication during the following year, if not before. So yeah, it was insane. It was an insane idea. And I just got on, started designing it, put the message out there on social media, said, hey, I'm doing a thing. And I kind of figured that I'd built some goodwill up over a couple of years with iamb. So I figured people would trust me enough to roll with this and see if I could pull it off. And thankfully they did. And for some people, I think you mentioned Mary Ford Neal. She claims it's one of her favorite journals, which is wonderful.
But it's that thing that you are showcasing the poem, you're showcasing the word. You, in a similar way with iamb, as you said, this is a setup, this is how it looks. You click on it, you have a brief blurb, a photograph, you have the 3 poems, you can listen to the voices. And with After, in a similar way, it's one poem, you get to read that poem and that's it. And in a way, it's almost like, every fortnight you can kind of pop into this gallery and see this new piece that's on exhibition and stick with it for a while. And you're not sort of fussed by everything else that's going on around it, because this is it. This is what you get to look at. And you really do spend a lot more time considering it, because you don't have to go on to the next thing. And nowadays, especially if it's something that's on the phone, we're so used to scrolling. It's like our fingers are already moving, they don't kind of stop.
That's precisely why I did it. I think there's just too much going on in our lives every single day, and to just take a moment, just 15 minutes out of your evening once a fortnight to pick up on this poem. And of course there is the behind the poem as well below it. So I didn't just want to, because that's the thing as well, I didn't understand after poetry because I only ever saw it in the context of collections. There was normally just title, after whatever, poem, but unless I knew the thing that it was after, I had no idea what it was about. So I wanted people to come forward with a little 100-word max kind of block of text, just to say, this is what inspired it, this is where it came from. That way we all get to learn a bit more, as well as getting to see some great poetry.
And sometimes that's the thing. It's the conversation that comes around it. When you go into a gallery to see a piece of art, very often it's with your partner, it's with a mate, and you might wander off, but every now and then you'll come together and you have this little dialogue about what it is and what it means to you and what it means to them. And like last year, I gave, I think, about 6 or 7 after workshops here in Ireland, and the intriguing thing was the stories that were leading them into it. We had a selection of artwork or paintings or photographs that they could pick. And, we spoke about them first, and we spoke about what we felt drew us in, what it was. And sometimes, people would pick the same thing, but it was always something different. So that is the interesting thing, with after poetry. You want to have a little bit of an idea of, is it something about the artist that you're drawing into it? Because very often that's it. And unless you know the artist, you don't know the history. So yeah, kudos on giving us the backstory.
And now it's time for our final special guest on this episode, and he joins us from rural Spain. His work has appeared in places like iamb, Black Bough Poetry. He's been a guest frequently here on Eat the Storms and also in the Madrid Review. His essays and short stories have also appeared in Dark Mountain Project. And his debut collection, Consolamentum, was just published earlier this year by Black Bough Poetry. And I'm delighted to say he'll be with us reading from that collection in January. Now, to read one of Mark's poems, and of course one of his own, this is James McConchie.
Keep counting. We found a way to play this game. Then you found the best hiding place of all. Under shingle, marble, your dates in gold, under sun, rain, snow. I covered my eyes as you were closing yours, as you made yourself invisible at last. Made it so your finding was all we had left. But I can still see you, mate, with my eyes shut. And when I close them for good, ready or not, I'll look for you. I just have to keep counting, don't I? Keep counting till it's my turn to hide. Almost September. I pray God I have a foolish future. Enough to remember the simple, sylvan joys of this happily futile afternoon. Talking with a vague acquaintance, and the knowledge that we'd come to like each other. This undemanding company, infrequent interludes. Two men, a little grey now, each with his stories best not told, living alone at the fringe, these soft settlements of stone. Some laughter from the office of the mayor tumbles out, for want of any urgent energy, across the empty square. It's still August after all. And anyway, who cares? Two old ladies, out for bread in slippers. Swallows frantic fattening over the ivy by the village bar. That funny thing the car did for a while must have fixed itself at last. Green contraband tucked down my shorts, so home down through the dogwoods, smiling, cross the river at the ford.
I want to go back because you mentioned maybe you've written some. There's one, isn't it? Virginia Woolf, the painting of Virginia Woolf. That like it has that edge to it.
Yeah. It's a photograph of her. It's one of the most famous ones. It's when she's in profile and she's quite young. And yeah, I spotted it in my ex-wife's flat about a year after we split up, and I just kind of thought, oh, I've seen that before. I remember reading Virginia Woolf's and Vita Sackville-West's love letters to each other many years ago, being very wrapped up in it. And it was literally just coming home from that experience, and I just wanted to write it down. And the way it ends is a little bit obscure, because unless you know the story of the music that was played at Woolf's, I think it was the memorial rather than the actual service, but they played Gluck's Dance of the Blessed Spirits, which is why I weaved that into the last line, because I wanted it to be acknowledged, even if I wasn't going to say it out loud.
Yeah.
With a little bit of history just put in there, you know.
And it's so witty as well, because you have that added extra, but I think the line before that, it was sort of acknowledging that your ex-wife is looking on it as something. I think it was as her aging, but you know, it was those two different perspectives on the one painting.
Yeah.
And speaking of after poetry, Mark asked me to pick one of his poems to read, and I think perhaps it fits if I read the poem that we've just spoken about. So from Subruria, this is a portrait of Virginia Woolf. Dropping off our daughter at your flat. I see you've bought a portrait of Virginia Woolf. It's a picture of her I've not seen in years. Not since I read Vita's love letters to her. You can tell she was troubled, even in this. Almost feel the weight that would pull her under. Like her, we share that unsteadiness of mind. Streams of consciousness deep enough to drown in. But while you see only her photograph's age, I hear blessed spirits dancing her to rest. And so the poem of my own that I've chosen to read for this special episode is also an after poem. It's a poem inspired by the painting Habitation de l'Hôtel, Living in a Hotel, by Edward Hopper, which he painted back in 1931. As with all of Hopper's paintings, you look long enough, there's a story there. There's a story waiting to be told. Always these delicate balances of shadow and light. This one is a woman sitting alone in a hotel room. There are cases, bags by her feet. She's holding in her hand a note, a letter, a timetable. We're not quite sure what. She looks resigned. There is a window behind her. There's a shutter half pulled up or half pulled down. And this is the story that I heard when I looked in it. This is called Hotel. She unpacks all that she can fit into a space not hers. These sheets scented of other skin that others left while passing. She undresses before the window, pulls a black shade up against the light of a day at odds with the night of this room. Sound swims through heat and laughter. Too light for a single weight forces its way in. A wave punch in the gut of all she has swallowed. There are trains in her hands. Times of parting. But all she wants is to sink down in there, under the magnolia of a room not hers, not theirs. The carpet is moss, and she wonders if it will climb along the skin that's grown tired of touch, until she becomes just another stain in its thread. A disappearance, but for her scent, that someone will find in passing, though it won't remember her name.
So in 2025, you are going to be joining the Hoglets on the Hedgehog Poetry Press farm.
I am indeed. At long last, I'm doing something I never thought I would do, and I am putting myself under the auspices of a publisher rather than being the publisher myself.
This is a brave step.
It is. It feels brave. in a very minor way, obviously, with everything going on in the world at the moment. But yeah, it does feel brave.
So we're having snapshots. Sorry, we're having like snapshots into Subruria.
Yes, essentially, yeah, absolutely. I wanted to I was aware that through social media, I've shared a lot of the same poems repeatedly, and I found then that at open mics, people have said, "Oh, can you read the one about the such and such?" Or they've mentioned the title if they've been able to remember it, and that's wonderful because it feels like I've done what I wanted to do, which was, despite self-publishing, I've managed to get a little bit of traction out there. People understand some of my work, remember who wrote the poem, and so I thought, okay, I know there are people out there who actually have said to me many times, I want to own a thing that you've done, not just go with everybody else to the website and read it with everybody else. And so I thought, okay, I give the people what they want. I'm being mock grandiose there, of course, but yeah, the idea of actually producing something. So I went to Mark Davidson at Hedgehog, and I just said, look, I've kind of got this idea about doing a sort of best of the first 3 releases of Subruria. I envisage it being about 27 poems, maybe with some extras in a separate physical but digital thing. Won't be a book. But essentially, I went to him about the ebook side of things, because I thought that's very much my ethos, and I'd love to see a bit of Subruria in an ebook. And he jumped at the chance. He was really, really happy about that. And he said, yep, that sounds great. So we've been working on that over the past few months. But yes, it will be a decent spread from those first 3 releases. And much like in the releases of Subruria itself, 2/3 of it will focus on the suburban, 1/3 will be on the rural. Because when I think about Subruria, that's how I think of it. 2/3 of my life is very much in the what we would typically call suburban world, and 1/3 of it is connected to the natural world around me, and the spaces just beyond my back door, really.
And you deliberately, I think I read in an interview you were saying that you deliberately in the poems you try and not let them merge in, even though perhaps the suburban is already sort of overtaking the rural in a sense, but you try and keep them separate and individual.
It was one of two rules I set myself, Damien. I said, firstly, I'm never going to use the word Subruria in a poem. That's not going to happen. And secondly, I'm not going to mix the streams, to use a Ghostbusters reference from many, many years ago. I'm not going to try to make the two things live in the same poem. The whole idea of it is this weird juxtaposition of, oh, I've just had this poem about something that happened in an underpass in a town, and now suddenly I'm with a man flying a hawk on a hill. You know what I mean? I want that kind of that cross section, and I want to kind of surprise the reader. They don't know what's coming next. They don't know what the next thing will be. But what I hope in years from now, as the project builds, people can take a zoom out and stand back from it and say, "Oh, now I see. Now I see the picture. Now I see what he's trying to do with this and how this all comes together." And I believe it will come together, but there are things I have to do yet that I haven't done on the site. For example, different ways of indexing it. So at the moment, it's just indexed by release. But I'll index it by theme, I'll index it by type, I'll index it by year. So you can see the chronology, because at the moment, the chronology is all over the place. I kind of want you to be able to read it as a loose leaf book, to see it in all different kinds of ways, and kind of get your own Subruria from the various poems that are in there together. I mean, I describe it as a protracted Romana Clef in verse, and it is. That's exactly what it is. I am essentially writing my first novel, but I'm doing it in verse, and I'm doing it kind of about me and my life, but I'm trying to blend fact and fiction, and I'm trying to obscure bits and clarify other bits. And ultimately, I think by the end of it, people will be able to see that with it being indexed in a variety of different ways, people will then be able to recombine Subruria to create their own version of it. Yeah. They can read it any way they like. I'd love to be able to get to a place where I could offer a system where they could favorite poems in there and create their own little version of Subruria as a sidebar. You know, that would be a wonderful thing to be able to do. It's all stuff that I'm going to get AI to do eventually, because I haven't got the skills for it. But the poems will always be written by me and always be revised by me. I will never let that happen. That's a line too far.
But that's an intriguing way, I think, if people can kind of like do their own journey. Like I remember in the 80s, there were these books where you got to a certain page and you could pick, it was like pick your own adventure, you could decide where you wanted to go next. So you could read the same book 3 or 4 times or maybe even more. But when you do go into Subruria, there's a familiarity to it, even though it's not yours immediately. But I think you can easily become an inhabitant. And if you have that ability to play around and, to do your own layout, then it becomes even more personal to the reader as much as it is personal to you.
I would like that to be the case, but that is very much for the future. Yeah. I have recently had to change the layout a little bit of Subruria. It still has that kind of coffee table book feel, but I originally had it set up more like a double page spread with some information on one side and the poem and other things on the other side. The only reason I've stopped that at the moment is because the site hosting company with which I'm building it, they have a bit of a conflict between how things look on mobile and how things look on desktop, and the work involved to keep marshalling those two is too much for me at the moment. Yeah. But I will eventually, when I eventually rebuild this thing in proper code from scratch, eventually, it will happen, I'm sure of this, I'll go back to the kind of coffee table book styling, because that's what I always intended.
And so then next year, with Scenes from Subruria with Hedgehog Press, it's going to be poems from each of the 3 releases, and then will there be extra poems, or will there be pieces that haven't appeared yet, or sort of B-sides?
Yes, there will. There'll be at least 9, and they're going to come from future releases, but they won't be in the ebook. They will be in the limited edition physical digital thing, which which I'm still not revealing at this stage because we haven't finished thrashing out the format. But yeah, essentially, this was actually Mark's idea. I give credit to Mark for this. This was his idea. He said, it's great we can do an ebook, but I think we can do something else. And he showed me some ideas, things done in his past. And I looked at it and I thought, oh, I like that. It feels both modern and fresh, but also a little bit retro, which, let's face it, a lot of Subruria is a little bit retro. So I thought, yeah, this really works. I kind of like this. So yeah, there'll be a big reveal nearer the time, but yeah, there will be a physical thing in a limited edition of, I think, about 200 copies, which will go on sale in April of 2025.
I hear 200 pings already going at the beginning of April in 2025. Mark, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for letting us have this special episode to talk about your work, to talk about the community that you're building, and to hear other people read your work. Mark, thank you so much for now.
Thank you, Damien. It's been a pleasure.
And after all that talking, it's time to hear our special guest read. So this is Mark Antony Owen reading from Subruria. And after the podcast, you can head over to subruria.com and hear him reading from all 3 releases so far available from the 9 that there will be in total.
"6:25 a.m. In the rear-view mirror, a dawn wounded pink, bruised as clouds on a child's legs. Houses, not yet houses, just shapes scissored cleanly from a swelling sky. The light, wiping the night's dirt from each home's blooded face. At Pagham. You leave the waves like a long-legged wader, leave the froth and fizz of a sun-struck sea's sighs, butterscotched patches of sand made butterpats, flattened and pebble-pressed by high tides and toes. Your mother's shutter, enclosing like weather, up by our clothes, closing in on our ocean. She's shooting the shoreline, freezing us in frame. A silver lip lapping, blown beach in our teeth. Gliders. A gnat's ghost beneath a cumulative graze. Cessnas gargling and spitting you into columns of rising air. You look, down here, from this city of weeds and wildflowers, like a mobile, strung above a nursery of calves. Charms, tin-snipped from a rainbow, braceleting the sun. Symbols of hope, mirrored by the hair streaks escaping our feet. Taught sex on a rally racer. Did I know where babies came from, he asked me. And like most kids, I said hospital, I guess. Chasing through vandalised streets on his racer. A 6-speed rally he'd named for the SkyTrain. Such innocent, unspoiled days. A paradise. Me 8, him 15, both of us outsiders. I'd perch white-knuckled on the rack at the rear, clasping his saddle stem, fearing for my life as he tutored me in how that life began. Truth, a fruit to savour. This is how I fell. The rest of that day spent flying, me shrieking, "Darren put his willy in Natasha's cunt," crowing till my verses reached my mother's ears, as my father's hand reached the backs of my legs. What did I care now? I had tasted knowledge. Chevre. Sudden smoke in the elbow of the road clouds the penciled sketch of a dawn. Shadows holding the places of trees as we stutter, slow, on the headlamp's rails, strain to keep their outline steady. This crossing, broken free of its sign, this ghost caravan evaporating. Light lifts the eyelid of the sky. All day we will tell of what we saw.
And as typical here on Eat the Storms, we always have one extra poem before we finish. Usually it's me sharing a poem, but I've already done that. So, sharing another poem from Subruria. From Release 3, this is Mark Antony Owen.
Into astronomy. It started same as always, you getting a magazine on it. Your new obsession, the universe. All the space you needed to distract you from all you would never be. You saved for a telescope, nothing astronomical, just one with power enough to blow up the moon, resolve its scars to canyons, make sense of light peeping in at night's moth holes. Looking up, scanning a sky filled with absences, I wonder which one you are.
Poetic peeps and gentle persons, in-betweeners and nonconformers, genders all and genders equal. We've reached the end of this special episode of Eat the Storms, the poetry podcast. Here to celebrate the writing, the musings, the poetic platforms and the community formations of the one, the only, Mark Antony Owen. Thank you, the listeners, for tuning in today, whether that has been on places like Spotify, Apple, Google, Breaker, Podbean, Player FM, Overcast, Pocket Cast, Castbox, Podcast Addicts, iTunes, Amazon Music, and now even YouTube. A huge thank you to the genius that is Mark Antony Owen for letting us to gather today to talk, to discuss, to listen, and to celebrate his work. And of course, a thank you to all of my wonderful guests who joined us on the show today. Natalie Holborow, Jen Feroze, Georgia Hilton, Briony Collins, and James McConchie. For details on all of my guests, you can head on over to the blog post at eatthestorms.com. Click on the podcast section. There you'll find a blog post for every episode. This was episode 9, season 9. And in that blog post, you'll find photos, bios, and social media handles so you can find, follow, and be fantastic friends to each of my fantastic guests on the show today. And there, of course, you can find out everything you need to know about After Poetry, about iamb, about Subruria, and of course, keep an eye out for what's coming up, as in 2025 the Hedgehog Poetry Press will be giving us scenes from Subruria. Now, that's it from me. Thank you so much again for tuning in. Next week, as I said, we have our special Christmas episode, Christmas with Eat the Storms. We'll be having a host of poets from all around the world join in. And after that, we have only 4 more episodes before we're done with season 9. Thank you so much for tuning in, for listening, for sharing, for screaming, for asking to take part. It is much appreciated. Now, off you go, buy your presents, wrap your presents, mull the wine, stuff the turkey, and if you're not having turkey, make sure the nuts are roasted. This has been Eat the Storms. I've been Damien Donnelly. Thank you so much for joining us, and until next week when we'll be up to our necks in tinsels, baubles, and all things festive, please ensure that you stay bloody poetic.